And when we think about the coastal zone, scenic and geologic, it is that area where we have this dynamic interface between the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere. It's also an area where changes occur quickly and where potential conflicts are established. We see that it's an area of potential resource extraction. We see that it's an area of recreational potential. So part of our efforts is try to balance these sometimes mutually conflicting ways of utilizing that resource. Okay, so when we look at it, one of the things that fascinates me and many people is the rate at which things change. In geology, we often have to talk about things that occur over millions of years. Continents drifting at the rate your fingernails grow. Yet here, when we look at the coastline, you can look at a very calm day with gentle swells, and very quickly it can change to a storm, and that house that's got a $1 million view is no longer worth $1 million. So when we look at the impacts of those geologic processes, we recognize the role that scientists can play in terms of trying to minimize the risk. If we look at how in the U.S. People are at risk of dying, we see that 1900 was not a good year. What happened in 1900? Galveston hurricane, okay. So in general, we haven't been losing as many people, and that is, quite frankly, because of our ability to predict and evacuate. On the other hand, we've been increasingly suffering property or economic loss. And I should add, this is in constant dollars, this particular case, $2,000. So we've seen an arguably exponential increase in the loss, economic losses at the same time. And that is in part because we are, the population distribution in the United States, and to a lesser extent worldwide, is drifting to the coast. We are becoming increasingly vulnerable to coastal hazards as we move to the coastline. And the coastline itself is getting more hazardous as we see a rise in relative sea level, both because of natural and anthropogenic or human impacts as well. The other problem that we're seeing, and we'll get into this a little later in more depth, is the reduction of sediment to the coast. We're changing the sediment budget. And so that will adversely impact us. And there are other human activities, mainly structural features, where we try to, in essence, protect one aspect of the coastline only to put another at risk. So these are all reasons why we are losing more and more, have greater and greater economic losses. If we look at the rate at which coastal cities or counties rather are growing relative to the interior U.S. Through 1990, it was continuing, and in fact, that trend continues through 2015. So we're seeing this increasing vulnerability because of the shift to coastal areas. If we look at coastal shoreline counties, we're way up here, 125 people per square mile, whereas in the U.S. as a whole, it's about 36. So there's not only more people, but not a surprise, implicitly and explicitly, increased density of population sitting in those areas where coastlines, coastal processes can impact us. Even in Texas, if we look at the overall rate of population increase, certain coastal areas, interestingly enough, South Texas is the area that's projected to be growing even faster than the state of Texas. And I was surprised to see that the Houston-Galveston area will more or less track the U.S. the state population. Some other areas are low density and not of interest. But I think one of the things we're seeing is that South Texas will become an increasingly important area with respect to coastal hazards as the demographics of the state of Texas changes. Now that rise in sea level we talked about, part of it is due to a global ocean rise. This is the rise in Galveston, but another part of it is due to, in this case, land subsidence. So we're seeing that about in the the Galveston area, about a third of the sea level rise is due to global factors, and those global factors include the influence of increased global warming because of human-introduced CO2. And then a significant factor, arguably the more important factor here, is land subsidence. But the reality is, whereas this particular element, this is called the eustatic sea level or worldwide sea level rise, that's affecting worldwide, but the relative importance of other factors will vary literally throughout the world, even throughout the Gulf Coast. Now, if we look at people at risk, well, where are we going? There's at least two predictions we could look at in terms of what sea level will be like in 2100, in about 80 years, 85 years. And one is that it will rise about 0.8 of a meter. The other is 1.8. Which one's right, we won't know for a while. I'll never know. But the point is, these are the increased amount of people impacted by extra flooding. Okay, so that even taking the minimal rise, we're looking at an additional 4 million people in the U.S. being subjected to coastal flooding associated with that rise in sea level. And of course, that number is much higher if, in fact, the rate of sea level rise is higher as well. So we're talking about an increasingly large number of people that will be impacted in the future. Now, one of the good things is that we have had, and we've had since that really dynamic decade of the late 60s or mid 60s to mid 70s, a coastal zone management program, Coastal Zone Management Act, that includes a coastal zone management program which is run by the individual states, set up by the states, that basically try to deal with these competing issues of land and water. There's a national estuary project of which Galveston Bay was one of the major elements. And then there's a fund for state and local areas to purchase endangered land. And so this particular Act of 72 continues to be a major part. In fact, it was amended in 2005 and continues to be a major driver. Okay. In fact, today, if we look at the Texas Coastal Zone Management boundary, it's these yellow areas, and notice it extends offshore as well. So it extends, let's see, it's either 9 or 11. I think it's not, I can't remember now. But anyway, it extends offshore. And so this is just an idea of the counties that are impacted by that. And one of the things to keep in mind is that the drainage areas extend far inland of the boundary. And so one of the things we have to keep in mind is that things that are happening outside of the coastal zone boundary is impacting the coastal zone. And so sometimes that leads to some complications and some confusions and some difficulties. We'll talk about some examples of that. There was a report done by the Heinz Center to FEMA. Remember, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, is responsible for dealing with things like flood hazards and the like. And they found that, maybe to their surprise, not to others, that the Gulf Coast is eroding a lot. And these rates actually are low compared to more recent rates. But in terms of maybe 6 feet per year, areas around Galveston, 5 or 6 feet per year. And more importantly, perhaps, is that that erosion is resulting in significant loss of property on the order of $50 million a year, of which about $10 million is covered by federally subsidized flood insurance. So that's what got FEMA's attention, that, oh, there's a lot of things going on besides just flooding. Erosion is occurring as well. So this kind of an aha moment was the same for FEMA with rivers. We talked about, by the way, it's not just rivers flood, they erode, and in many cases that's worse because there's nothing left. And so as that one of the things they looked at was an area around western Galveston, and they said, okay, here's a photo. I forget when the photo was taken, but this is the shoreline at the time of the publication. And based on the rates of erosion, this is where the shoreline is going to be in 30 years and 60 years. That's kind of scary because all of those houses will be gone if this prediction is correct. And so these are houses that will be gone unless we do something about erosion. In fact, their conclusion is that perhaps as much as 50% of the structures within 500 feet of the present Gulf are going to be gone in 60 years. Okay, and if we look at Bolivar Peninsula after Hurricane Ike, that doesn't seem like such an unreasonable assumption that we've got a lot of houses at risk, a lot of property at risk due to a combination of coastal storm surge, erosion, and wind. Okay. Most recently, and this is actually this is 2017. This is a March 2017 report. No, I take that back. This is 2016. Average erosion is 4 feet per year. 64% is eroding at 6 feet per year or more. Some up to 30 feet per year or more. So the erosion rates are extraordinary. Okay. The other thing is FEMA suggests that for every dollar you spend on erosion control and mitigation, you get $4 back. Now, that's an interesting way of looking at it, or better said, it's an interesting way of calculating it because you have to assign dollar values to a lot of intrinsic things. But the point is that there's a lot of pressure to try to deal with these issues of erosion and loss of property, and to a lesser extent, loss of life. If we look at a map of the rate at which we are either growing or losing land in the state of Texas, the green dots are those areas where we're actually gaining land. You're going to have to look carefully because they're hard to see. There's no question but that it is largely orange, and it is largely eroding, and in many cases over 4.5 meters a year. Okay? Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, the first thing is we're going to delineate those areas of erosion. Okay? And so we've defined that, I guess because you have to define it as something, as an area that's eroding greater than 2 feet per year. Okay? And you define a critical erosion area, and this turns out to be an important distinction because this allows us to define the areas that are most important and therefore most in need of mitigating. These are areas that are eroding by that amount and are a threat to public health, safety, welfare, beach access, fill in the blank. It's not only eroding, but it's eroding and it's causing a problem. Okay, and so those are the critical coastal erosion areas that we have delineated now and now are trying to figure out what to do with. Okay, just an example here are the very few areas that are actually non-eroding, and they are the exceptions. And we'll talk about some of these areas in terms of why they're not eroding. And as it turns out, they're not eroding can in fact be causing other areas to erode. Like here, let's look at this area right here. That's right here. Anything above this line is deposition. Okay. Well, those are being deposited, or rather the sediment is being deposited because of the effect of the jetties along Bolivar Roads, the entrance ship channel. So we can begin to explain why certain areas are not eroding and look at a broader sense why everything else is eroding. Okay. It seems like a silly question, but what do we mean by shoreline erosion? That is to say, what is the shoreline? Is it the water line here? Is it this wet line here? Is it this dune line here? That is a fundamental issue that needs to be answered before we can even define areas of erosion. Okay. Well, it turns out that we distinguish between two types of beaches. There is the wet beach, which is defined, and I'll show it in a moment, as basically the area between low and high tide. Okay. There's the dry beach, that is that portion of the beach above high tide. And then there is the dune line, which is vegetated. So those are at least three reasonably easy ways of differentiating a portion of the coastal zone. So here we have the dry beach, wet beach, and intertidal, and then this, from here on, it's vegetated. So that's the vegetated dune line. Okay. Now, in fact, what we say is that is a naturally occurring vegetation line. Now, the reason to make that distinction is because you could plant some grass in the middle of the dry beach and call it the vegetation line. Now, you might wonder why you would want to do that, but you could. And it turns out there's a good reason for you to want to do it, and there's an even better reason that you shouldn't do it, or you shouldn't let people do it. So let's look at that issue of the wet and dry beach and what it means in terms of land use controls. Well, first of all, here is the area of the wet beach. And you realize that the, quote, dry beach is occasionally wet. Okay, so let's keep that distinction in mind, that dry beach is simply the area above high tide, and it's going to be wet, but it's a very distinct area. And, of course, here's the vegetated line. So why is it important? Well, it's important because of the Texas Open Beach Act. Okay? And what it says is that this area here, the dry beach, is private land, but it's a public easement, which is to say you own the land all the way down to high tide, but you cannot prevent the public from accessing the dry beach. And that makes Texas actually fairly unique, but unusual, better said, because there's a lot of places in the U.S. where you can't get on a beach. It's private land, no access. And that turns out to be a major advantage, or used to be a major advantage of the Texas area. The public had access to every beach along the entire stretch, along that 350 miles of shoreline. Okay. Now, that was been the law since 1959, and one of the implications is that this naturally occurring vegetation line is a rolling easement. Now, what that means is if the vegetation line, which is the land that defines the public easement, if it moves, so too does the public easement. So if we've got erosion occurring, then the dry beach is now where the dunes used to be, and that public easement rolls with the naturally occurring vegetation line. Okay. Again, a major question, particularly where we have an area that's predominantly eroding. Okay. Now, unfortunately, in 2010, and I'm not going to have you read this, but actually it's interesting for you to read on your own, a landowner that had bought some houses that were in an eroding area from California decided to challenge the Open Beach Act because the erosion was actually putting their houses, her rental houses, on the public beach. Rather, better said, on the public easement. Okay, and so what they said is, if that is what the Texas Supreme Court said, is if the public easement is moving due to gradual and imperceptible changes, then it is a rolling easement, no problem. But if it's suddenly and dramatically pushed landward by acts of nature, well, then that is a problem, and that it doesn't roll. So in a case like that, it says that if the high tide moves gradually, the easement migrates, but if it moves suddenly, it doesn't. Well, now that illustrates, among other things, an extraordinary lack of understanding of how the naturally vegetation line moves. It occurs in storms. It moves in storms. That's how it moves. It doesn't move gradually and imperceptibly. It moves suddenly in storms. And then some is recovered, and it moves suddenly. And some is recovered, etc. But what this has done, it has basically made the public easement moot in these areas of rapid erosion. And just as one consequence of that, it would be possible for people to fence off that area now. And it makes it impossible to use state money to bring in sand to beach nourish the area to try to protect the area, because you can't use public resources that way. So this has impacted the use of the coastal zone and issues of coastal erosion an extraordinary amount. And this is overturning common law that goes back to the days of the Spanish. So this is continuing to be an issue that the state's having to deal with. So let me just illustrate the issue. This is Galveston Island. That little area is Bermuda Beach. And this is Bermuda Beach in 1956, in 1996, and 2056. Okay. Bermuda Beach isn't going to be around if something isn't done to try to minimize the erosion. Okay. But as we'll see, our options are limited. They're even more limited now because this line is moving. How is it moving? It's moving by storms. So you want to know how this line goes from here to here? Well, you simply have to look at the movement of the line by sudden storm events. Yet, according to the Supreme Court, this is no longer the naturally occurring vegetation lines over here. This is now private land. Okay. And that's what's happening. Okay. And of course, it's not here, just here. Erosion is happening all over, from the Pacific coast to the East Coast. And if you look at a map of erosion, it turns out that almost all of the United States and even the Great Lakes is suffering from erosion. Okay, so this is not a problem unique to Galveston or Texas or the Gulf Coast, nor is it unique to the United States. It's worldwide, in part because many of the reasons for the increased losses that I mentioned earlier are global. The drivers are global issues, only one of which is eustatic sea level rise. Well, there's a lot of worry about it. It's in the papers a lot. The shoreline is eroding. There's lawsuits to prevent the houses from being removed. In fact, it's kind of interesting because erosion has resulted in this house now being on state land. And so the state says you're trespassing and wants these houses removed. And they're saying, well, it may be seaward at low tide, but the land is never submerged. And, that seems like a silly argument. But remember, I did say earlier that there are differences in terms of land ownership changes depending on whether or not it's due to erosion or submergence. But this would be clearly a case where up until 2010, that land is now state. Now, as of 2010, they're saying no, that was eroded because of catastrophic events and storms, and so there's no loss of property. Okay, so this is a huge issue. Beach owners left up the creek. They throw in the towels, suffer heavy damage. These are problems we've got continuing along the Texas coast. Okay. Now, to understand coastal issues, coastal problems, and in order to try to solve them, there are several pieces of information you need to have, and you need to know something about the wave climate, the sediment budget, the idea of a littoral shelf. So let's look at those separately. The wave climate is a way of statistically viewing the wave energy along a particular place of the coast. How much and how long and what direction. Okay, so we want to know the height and the period and the direction. Height and period, I might add, are variables that define the wave energy. Okay, so if we look at wave energy, the energy in waves is in part, obviously, it begins with the energy in wind, because these are wind-generated waves. And so there's a transfer of energy, transfer of kinetic energy, from the wind to the waves, and it's a function of about the wind velocity to the fourth power. So there's a large amount of energy that's transferred from wind to waves. And also, not a surprise, the longer you're transferring that energy, the more energy is transferred. And the larger the area over which you're transferring that energy, the more energy is transferred as well. So we talk about the velocity, duration, and fetch. In fetch, if you think of the area over which the wind is blowing, and if this is direction, the distance measured in the direction the wind is blowing of the area of the storm is the fetch. Okay, so that will determine the wave energy as they leave that storm. Okay, energy itself is proportional to the square of the amplitude. Power, which arguably is maybe more important, is proportional to the period times the square of the height. I'm simply going to say that wave energy is proportional to the square of the height. For the engineers and the others that are interested in equations, these are the equations. You just need to remember height squared. Okay, and so if we look at height globally, we realize that there are global variations in wave height that respond to global variations in wind patterns. Again, not a surprise. We see in areas, bands, if you like, of very high waves in areas around 40 to 60 degrees north and south. Those are the storm latitudes. This is where we have the easterly and westerly winds colliding. This is the area where in the U.S. we're getting our cold fronts coming down. Of course, offshore, that's the areas of what we call the nor'easters. Okay, so we've got significant regional variations, not only in wave energy, but the type of storms that cause them. So, for example, here in the Gulf, wave energy, for the most part, is fairly low, except during hurricanes or tropical cyclones and so on. So, whereas on the other hand, the Pacific North, or rather the Northeast, doesn't worry too much about hurricanes. Hurricane Sandy accepted, but they've got nor'easters that are major storm events. Okay, so here's how we might look at a specific area. Let's suppose we were interested in studying potential coastal issues around Oxnard. Well, we would look at the direction and period and wave heights of waves that might impact that. Now, as it turns out, for that area, we've got some shadow zones. We've got some protected areas. So basically, we're looking at waves coming in from very specific directions. Okay, so we've kind of defined the protected directions and the open parts. And then we look at a wave rose. This is a wave rose. This is one of many that are basically wave gauges in the middle of the ocean. Actually, they're on the continental shelf for the most part, that look at the direction and height of waves throughout the year. So this is an annual wave rose. And it says that most of the waves are coming from the northwest, heading towards the southeast. So that's the first thing. And if you look at the heights, look at these oranges, you can see where most of the oranges are coming in. So you can see what percentage of the time you have what wave energy and from what direction. So you can calculate the amount of wave power, the amount of wave energy that's hitting the coast based on these offshore wave roses, based on calculations of how wave energy is transformed across the shelf, and how offshore islands might protect or change it. Okay. Now, if you know the wave energy, the next thing you need to know is the sediment budget. And sediment budget is basically a summary of all the sources and sinks of sediment along the beach. Where is it coming from? Where is it going? And a related issue is, what is the net budget? Is it a net loss, a net gain, or is it pretty much balanced? Because a net loss means erosion. A net gain means deposition. More or less a balanced budget means a stable shoreline. Okay, so we're interested in areas that have different sediment budgets and why. Okay, and we can think of it in an even more simplistic way of saying the rate at which mainly sand is removed, mainly by wave energy, versus the rate is being resupplied. Think sediment supply. So that wave energy that's coming in from those storms offshore is removing sand, and we want to replenish it. And so that then gets into the question of what is the source of the sand. Well, we have three sources that are the main sources, and that's rivers, ironically erosion, and these two are extrapolated via longshore drift. So we basically have sediment entering the system by river systems and erosion of the coastline, and then it's being redistributed and brought to other places by longshore drift. There's some other minor areas, wind, glaciers, human activity, although this can be quite important. So we've got arguably 6 sources of sediment. And so we need to know quantitatively how much is being brought in by each of those. And we need to know quantitatively how much energy is available to move that through the wave budget, if you like. Okay. So let's just take a qualitative view. Let's look at the sediment budget around Freeport, around the mouth of the Brazos River. And so we see this plume of sediment here. That's sediment being introduced to the coast by the Brazos River. You see these little plumes here. Oops. That's sediment that is derived by erosion. Okay, much of this area is eroding. Same thing over here. And you see that that plume is being dispersed to what turns out to be the southwest by longshore drift. Okay, and you can see the impact of longshore drift here as well. So in this particular example, the winds and the waves are predominantly to the southwest, and that's typical of the upper part of the Texas coast. So if you've got a beach, or if you're interested in a beach and on this picture, then you're interested in those 3 sources of sediment. Okay. Now the sinks, where is it going? Well, how do we take sand away? Well, during storms, it moves offshore. Some of it moves back to the shore, but some of it stays offshore. So that's one way of permanently removing sediment. Another way is to trap it. The Brazos Delta is actually a sink. It's where sediment is being trapped. So that would be an area that has a positive sediment budget because there's more sediment coming in because of the river than waves can remove. Okay, and as we'll see, not so much here, but when we look at areas of the West Coast, maybe submarine canyons. Okay. Now what that does, it gets us into the idea of a littoral cell. A littoral cell is basically a segment of the coast that looks at the entire history of the coastal sediment from where it got into the system, the source, to where it leaves the system, the sink. Okay? So in a very simple sense, imagine a river transported by longshore drift and then exiting by a submarine canyon. Okay? That would be one littoral cell. Okay? Here we've got a larger littoral cell. We've got multiple sources, erosion, rivers and erosion, until finally the sediment is exits that littoral cell through a submarine canyon. Okay. Now, the idea here that is you've got sediment coming in from erosion, you've got onshore and offshore erosion, river, dunes, by the way, are another way of removing sediment. You could bring them onshore. And then finally exiting here. This is analogous in many ways to a drainage basin. Remember when we talked about issues related to rivers? We said you really need to take into account the entire source of sediment. What is the entire area of the source of sediments for a particular place? It is the drainage basin. And similarly, the source of sediment for any particular area here was whatever that littoral cell is. And turns out it's also going to be influenced, obviously, by the drainage basin of those rivers that are providing the input for sediment. So you could impact the sediment budget by building a dam up here, okay, and therefore reducing the amount of sediment coming into the river. We see this in Southern California, where dams built near the coast are actually causing increased beach erosion because we're reducing the amount of sediment available for the sediment budget. So this is just an example of some cells in a rather tectonically active and geomorphically complicated area of the East Coast. And right here, this is Monterey Submarine Canyon. These major submarine canyons off the West Coast are basically the final conduits through which sediment is lost. Okay. In the case of the head of the Monterey Canyon, it's within a football field of the beach. So you can darn near throw a rock into the head of the submarine canyon. Okay. Now, we do need to understand how waves move sediment. Okay. And we need to understand how energy is transformed by waves. Okay. So the first thing is to remember that wind-generated waves are orbital waves. That is to say, they move in a circle, an orbit. There is a crest of that wave where the water is moving forward. There is a trough where the water is moving backwards. So for most of a wave's history, the water is just moving back and forth. There's no net motion of water. It's just going in a circle. The energy, of course, is being transferred, but not the water, and therefore not any sediment. As long as you have completely symmetrical motion, you're not having any net transport of sediment. Okay. Now, the wave height, remember, that's an important factor. That really determines what the wave energy is going to be, that in the period. That's basically the difference in elevation between the crest and the trough. And so we can think of the diameter of that orbital wave at the surface as being the height, and the square of that diameter then becomes the wave energy. Now, that orbital motion decreases with depth. And it decreases with depth because of energy attenuation. Basically, friction results in a loss of energy. And because energy is proportional to the diameter, the way we can visualize that is that the orbital diameter is decreasing with depth. Okay. Now, that energy is being moved in a particular direction, and as long as we've got orbital motion, it's dissipating with depth, it's basically being transferred in the direction that the wind set it. And one of the things we can do is we can look at the wavelength. Remember, that's also a variable. And we could define the wave period. Okay, the wave period is how long it takes for a wave to travel one wavelength. And so, strictly speaking, wave power is a function of the square of the height and the wave period. Okay, so all of these are variables that increase as we put more and more wind energy into waves. So the longer that storm goes, the bigger the waves, the longer the period, etc. Okay, and the other thing is, at some point, that wave energy, no matter how big it is, at the surface, decreases to the point where we consider it negligible at some depth. And that depth we call wave base. Wave base is the depth below which there's no significant movement of water. Okay, and conveniently, that's equal to 1/2 the wavelength. Okay. So as the wavelength increases, wave base increases as well. Okay. Now, as long as the bottom of the ocean, the bottom of the water body, better said, is deeper than wave base, that wave doesn't feel bottom. It doesn't know if it's 10 feet below its wave base or 10,000 feet below its wave base. And so we call it a deep water wave. It is moving basically at a rate that is a function of the period, and it's the rate that it was born with in the storm. And it leaves at that speed. Longer period moves faster than shorter periods. But as soon as it gets into water that is more shallow than its wave base, it slows down. It becomes a shallow water wave. And it enters what we call the zone of wave buildup. Until finally, at water depths approximately equal to the wave height, it breaks. And then from then on, the wave is transformed into the surf zone, etc. Okay. So here's our shallow water wave up there, and here's our deep water wave. Now, in this particular example, it looks like what they've done is they've actually increased the wave base. Okay. They basically now have a storm wave, and it's got such a long period and high amplitude that it's rubbing the bottom. In fact, notice it's no longer a circle. It's kind of an ellipse because we're deforming that wave motion. And we're beginning to have some influence on eroding sediment and transporting sediment. A deep water wave cannot transport anything on the bottom. It could transport something that is suspended perhaps, but not even then. It just is going to move with the surface of the water. But a shallow water wave, that's quite a different thing. And in this particular example, we simply increase the size of the wave. But in the previous example, we decrease the water depth. In each case, we're going from a deep water to a shallow water wave. Okay. Now, these are all the variables that are important. And you don't have to worry too much about it. But some are obvious. Wavelength, wave height, wave period. The speed is the speed of the wave is propagating, the wave depth, the wave base, the water depth, deep water, shallow water. When you think about it, that's pretty easy. Yeah, yeah. But these are terms that we're going to use and that will be important in terms of figuring out how wave energy is directed, how it impacts the coastal zone. Okay. So let's look at that wave again. Here we go from a deep water wave to a shallow water wave. Here it breaks. So let's look at this area right here. Now, All right. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. But notice that as this wave is touching bottom, it's going to become deformed, and it feels bottom. It begins to see some erosion, but the bulk of the erosion is actually going to occur where the energy is expended the most, which is in the breaker zone, the surf zone, and the swash zone. I'll define those terms in a moment, but basically where the waves are breaking. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that how fast these waves travel depends on whether or not it's a shallow water wave or a deep water wave. Deep water waves, their speed is only a function of period. Okay. Now, what that means is that the longer period waves travel faster than the shorter period waves. Because as you put more and more energy into waves, they get longer and longer periods. Long period waves tend to be the result of storms. And so early on, we've known that when you're standing on the beach and you begin to see some long period waves coming in, that's a harbinger that there's a storm offshore. Often time to move onshore, or move inland rather. Okay. But that's not the case with a shallow water wave. Once a shallow water wave begins to drag bottom, their speed now is no longer a function of its celerity or period. Rather, it's a function of water depth. The more shallow, the slower it gets. Okay. Now, so in short, deep water wave speed's a function of period. Shallow water wave speed's a function of depth. Okay. Now that has important implications, because as a wave gets into more and more shallow water, it slows down. Okay. And it begins to increase its wave height. Let's look at that. Here's shallow water, breaker zone. Okay. We're going to see what's happening as this slows down. Okay, within the zone of wave buildup. Okay. Well, the period, the length of time between crests stays the same. That's a conservative property of a wave. No idea why it is, but it is. Okay. Now that has some interesting implications though, because if the period, think of the spacing of two cars. Okay. If the period of a wave doesn't change, but the car in front slows down, the wavelength, the distance between those two cars, gets shorter. The wavelength decreases as the speed slows down. So think of that sinusoidal wave, and we're going to squeeze it. What's going to happen to the wave height? It's going to increase. So we see that in the zone of wave buildup, the wavelength decreases and the wave height increases. And because the speed is changing, wave refraction occurs. And wave refraction is the bending of wave rays because it's slower as you get closer to the shore. So this wave slows down. Out here, no change. That's because out here, it's a deep water wave. And if all the wave crests are moving in the same direction, the same velocity, they're going to be parallel to each other. But if it starts to slow down on this side, it begins to bend. That's wave refraction. There's wave refraction of light, it's wave refraction of water. Okay. So if we look at a picture of waves in Galveston, you can see the wave crest. You could calculate the wave period. You could actually look at where they're beginning to bend. Oops, well, I'll do that later. Here we can see that the wave crests are bending. So the wave rays, which are always at right angles to the wave crest, they're bending as well. So that's wave refraction. So look what happens at an irregular coastline. you have wave refraction that's causing the waves to slow down earlier in the headlands and later in the bays. So they're going to curve, and they're going to converge. Those wave rays are converging on the headlands, and they're diverging in the bays. Now, what wave ray convergent means is a concentration of wave energy. We're increasing the wave energy at the headlands, and we are decreasing the wave energy. We're spreading it out over a wider area over the bay. Not a surprise. We have erosion where areas of focus and deposition in areas of wave dispersion. So we've already seen this is one of the mechanisms for having variations in erosion or variation in rates of erosion and deposition by changes in wave refraction. Not just increasing and decreasing the height of the waves, but focusing the waves in certain areas and not in others. Okay. Now this picture here actually shows the zone of wave buildup. Okay. And at this point, the wave has gotten high enough that it actually breaks. So we know that here, depth is about equal to the wave height. We know that here, depth is less than wave base. Okay, so we're all beginning to see things and interpret things that we can see. And so look at these wave rays here. If I just drew a straight line, if that whole wave crest was moving at the same velocity, that wave ought to be here, but it's slowed down. It's way over here now. So we've got a major bending of waves and a bending of the wave rays. But notice, even here, there is an oblique component to that wave energy. And what that means is there is a component of wave energy that's directed parallel to the beach. And that component of wave energy is giving us our lateral or longshore transport of sediment. Okay. Now, notice here the waves are breaking. We're leaving the zone of wave buildup. The waves are crashing. They're becoming a unidirectional bore, a surf wave, and then they're moving back and forth in the swash zone. Okay. So clearly, these waves are breaking and they're coming across as a uniform bore, just a wall of water. Okay. Now we really are having a lateral transport of water. That water off here is just moving in a circle. You swim out there, you're not going to go anywhere. If you want to surf, you need to get in the surf zone where there is an onshore transport of water. Now you might also think, well, if there's onshore transport of water here, how come the land doesn't flood? And actually that is why we get a storm surge. We're piling so much water in a big hurricane or big storm that the water is actually piling up on land. But normally there's as much water moving offshore as onshore, and that's because of rip currents. So what we see there is, here's the breaker zone, there's the beach, this is the direction that the waves are coming in, this is the direction of our onshore transport. But as we'll see in a moment, there's longshore transport and offshore transport. So we've got these local areas of return flow. And these are our rip currents. And they are preventing this water from just piling up. Okay. So let's look at that longshore transport. It occurs in two places. It occurs in the surf zone and it occurs in the swash zone. Together, we talk about the littoral transport of sediment. Littoral transport of sediment is just our word for the transfer of sediment parallel to the coast. Okay. And some of it, most of it, is transported by longshore drift, which is basically sediment transported by a current that's set up by that oblique movement of waves parallel to the beach and in the surf zone. And then we have beach drift, which is this zigzag motion you may remember from freshman geology, as it moves up the coast at an angle, up the beach at an angle, down by gravity, up by waves, down by gravity. So we've got this up and back, up and back, up and back motion, and then we've got this current. It's moving like this. Okay, so here's water depth 0. That's basically the wet beach. Depth equal height. That's the breaker zone. Depth equal 1/2 L. That's the transition from deep water to shallow water, and the transition where the waves are bending. Also notice that the wave length is getting less and less as it slows down. Okay. So you've got the zone of wave buildup, the breaker zone, and the surf zone. Okay. So this is actually a useful diagram because it's a visual template for a lot of things that's going on. In fact, the only thing that's missing in this are occasional rip currents. Okay. So there's our beach drift. Oops. And longshore currents, okay, or longshore drift and beach drift, okay. So think about this diagram, and it will give you a lot of information that makes it perhaps easier to remember. Okay. So we've got that wave approach, zone of wave buildup, the breaker zone you see by the white areas, the surf zone, and then the swash zone. The longshore currents giving us longshore drift, and then the zigzag motion is giving us beach drift. And together, that's the area of longshore or littoral transport. Okay. Now that's a hugely important thing because that is a mechanism by which sand enters a particular beach and removes a particular beach. So if you are right here, you've got a source of sand moving in from your left and a removal of sand moving from your right. Now you might think that's kind of simplistic because it's a net zero. So the sediment budget, if you like, related to longshore drift is 0. Except it doesn't always leave, or it doesn't always enter. And so we're going to see that it is the interruption of the littoral transport that's the main variable in causing problems with respect to human activities on the beach. So let's track that down. Let's look at a map of shoreline changes in the area along the mouth of the Brazos River near Freeport. And this map here, published in '75, showed long-term erosion rates. And here, this is kind of nice. But there's a long stretch of maybe 12, 15 miles of the beach that has net accretion. You want that. So let's imagine that I wanted to build a condo or a beach house here. Well, based on this, that's a good area because it's actually got a positive sediment budget. It's growing. There's net accretion during that time. Okay? So here we are. Here's Quintana Beach, here's Surfside Beach, both of which are in the area of net deposition. Okay. But let's look at it like this. This is the graph that shows the rates of net deposition, and this is the map. Okay. All right, well, it's still looking pretty good. Net deposition, not a whole lot, but I'll take a little. except take a look right here. Here is a map of the shoreline at the mouth of the old Brazos River, Quintana Beach over here. 1942, and the red, that's 1976. That's a lot of erosion that's going on in an area that's supposed to have net accretion. Okay, and in fact, that's that whole area in here. Look at that. Well, the reason is this used to be the mouth of the river. The Brazos River used to go right through Freeport. And this used to be the Brazos Delta. Except the town of Freeport and Dow did not like all that dirty water flowing through here because they wanted to use it to pump water in. So they convinced the Corps of Engineers, why don't we move the river? Okay. And so they did around 1930. And let's see what happened. Well, here is that time from 1853 to 74, which was the basis of that first map. Well, up until 1930, this is where deposition occurred. I don't have from 1930 to 70, but I've got 65 to 73. Look at the rate of deposition, erosion rather. Deposition has shifted. Now what we've done, we've changed the sediment budget. This beach here had a positive sediment budget because it was getting sediment from the Brazos River. A lot of it. So it was actually growing. Well, what happens when you move the river? Well, first of all, notice the channel is a lot clearer. Okay. But now all that sediment is moved over here. In what direction is Longshore Drift? Well, we can see from here. It's moving away from this beach here. So we went from an area of net growth, a delta growing, to net erosion. And so this illustrates a variety of things, but maybe the most important is that the long-term record is not always the most useful record for predicting the future because things change. Can you think of another example where we've talked about that question of length of record versus predicting the future? Flooding, and more specifically, flood records. Well, it's not just the 100-year, but the fact is that the 100-year flood can change depending on which interval you look at. And if you look at too long a record, you may be combining apples and oranges. You may be combining before and after a dam or before and after urbanization. So it is kind of seductive to think about the more data, the better. But you have to be critical of the applicability of those data for the question in mind. And if the question is, what is the future stability of Quintana Beach, it certainly has nothing to do with the net deposition over a previous 100 years. Okay. Here's our shift of our sediment source, and you can even see little ridges that are kind of like meander scrolls, except they're actually beach ridges that are telling us the growth of the river. Okay. So here we have from 1933, 39, 48, 56, 71. We basically can chronicle the growth of that delta from the diversion in 1929. Okay. And we can actually look at an air photo and we can see how those deltas, shorelines show up in terms of the New Brazos River. Okay. Now, what I want to point out here, though, that little square here, that's the San Bernard River. San Bernard River is a smaller river that's downdrift of the Brazos River. Here it is, really before anything has happened. That's not quite true. About 15 years earlier, the river mouth was shifted closer. Okay? And take a look at this plume here. That's sediment that's moving in this direction, but it's not a big deal. Here's the Brazos, the San Bernard. Here's the shoreline. Well, now, this was the shoreline. Notice how the Brazos mouth has been deflected. And we're beginning to see these ridges, which reflects the longshore drift of sediment coming in from the new Brazos River. So it's actually beginning to deflect the mouth of the San Bernard because of all that new sediment. This is 1995. Well, by 2004, there's hardly any mouth left, and it's really way over here. 2005, it's pretty much dried up. You can walk across this. Okay. There's 2006. Yeah, you can walk right across the mouth of the San Bernard River. Now, that's got some implications. In 2006, I read this thing that we had too much sand. Now, I've never heard of a beach that had too much sand in Texas. Now, who these whiners are that are complaining? Well, they're the fishermen that used to go out the coast through the mouth of the San Bernard River. And they're high and dry. They can't do that. Okay? Literally, this is their problem. They can't get there. So what are you going to do? Well, they suggested make an artificial cut. That makes sense. And there it is. Okay? So now the fishermen come through. Here's the plume. We're getting sediment that's coming out from the San Bernard. Everybody's happy again. Until a year later. And a year later. 4 years later. Oh, shoot. It's filled up again. And of course, why is that? Well, because all this stuff here is still coming from the Brazos. Okay? And so, if you just make an artificial cut and don't do anything else, it's going to close up. Okay? So let's look at this, and here's the Brazos as well. The San Bernard as well. 74 to 2000. We've actually seen two things, which is interesting. The sediment that's coming down here is both from the river and erosion of the delta. Remember I said erosion and river input are the two primary sources of sediment. But they then are the feedstock for sediment to transport by longshore drift. And that had some pretty important implications. In fact, we can just take a quick air view. Here's 2009. Here's the new cut. Everybody's happy. And now 2011, that's where the new cut was. And now everybody's right back where we were. So when we look at this example, ironically, of too much sediment, we've got to ask ourselves, what can we do? Can we do things to prevent sedimentation? And can we do things to prevent erosion? So that's really the question. And so let's see if we have an answer. Well, there's basically two approaches. There is a structural approach. We're going to build things to prevent erosion. Okay. Things like groins and jetties and breakwaters and seawalls and geotubes. We'll talk about each of these specifically. And there's also non-structural approaches. Beach nourishment, abandonment, relocation, zoning. Basically a hard solution and a soft solution. That should sound an awful lot like flood issues. Do we build a dam? Do we build a levee? Do we channelize? Do we zone? Okay. We're having the same issues here along the coast. And in some cases for the same reasons. Okay. Remember when I said that downstream from a dam, when you trap the water, the sediment rather, upstream. You have upstream deposition. What happens downstream? We get erosion. And why do you get erosion? You get erosion because there's still energy, river energy in this case, to transport sediment. And moving water is kind of picky. It wants to expend that energy somehow, and if it's not expending that energy transporting sediment, it will erode until it has a comfortable amount of sediment. And the same thing happens on the coast. So now we're talking about longshore currents, not river currents. We're talking about wave-induced longshore currents versus river-induced flow. But it's the same concept. The sediment budget and removing sediment, how does that impact areas downstream? Okay. So in the time we have, it's about 10 minutes, let's look at some of those impacts. And let's look first of all at a groin. Now, by the way, this is something they could have done at the mouth of the San Bernard. So let's look at what this is. This is an impermeable structure at right angles to the shoreline. And the purpose is to trap sediment and prevent or reduce erosion, but it's mainly, let me rephrase that, the purpose is to trap sediment. But by doing so, it can reduce erosion. So let's look at, first of all, how it traps sediment. Well, here are a series of groins from the seawall. To trap sediment. So let's look at this here. Here's the beach. Here's the wind. Here's a groin. And this is an eroding beach. So if we don't do anything, that beach is going to be someplace else, and this house is going to be toast. So what do? You know that wave direction generates a longshore current. You trap the sediment. What does it do? It piles up. Fantastic. Because now this house not only is not eroding, it's got a nice beach in front of it. Except for this guy. His sediment budget now has been depleted of the sediment that was coming in by longshore drift. And so what's going to happen with him? Well, he's going to start eroding. That's going to start to erode. Screw this. I'm going to build a groin. Oops. Erosion. I want to build another groin. The groins are kind of like peanuts. You can't just build one, because you keep finding that the deposition that you create updrift is causing downdrift erosion. So they tend to occur in fields until finally you decide you run out of money or you quit. So pretty easy to tell the direction of longshore drift here because it's piling up on this side and eroding on this side. And it's also pretty easy to understand why there's a lot of groins. Because if you just built one, the erosion will be here. But what happens when you stop? Well, you actually have accelerated erosion. Okay. Now, why did they stop there? Well, look at the land use. Okay. So they stopped where the subdivision stopped. And so you're getting increased erosion at the end of the groin. And that's quite predictable. Now, it may be cost effective, but you are causing increased erosion and loss of land. So you have to anticipate that and be willing to accept it and or pay for it. But this is a good example of why they keep adding groins and why that's increasingly not an option that the Corps of Engineers likes to take. It's kind of like channelization or building dams. The Corps of Engineers has a do not harm policy. I'm not going to make it worse. Yet building groins makes it worse for somebody. Okay. Here's another example. Here we had groins that had been built. They stopped right here. Okay. Now the longshore drift was from top to bottom. They had a storm. And look at what happened with the increased downdrift erosion. Look how much more narrow that barrier island is. Okay? Next storm comes. That's an easy place to just breach entirely. So look at this. Happy people, unhappy people. Okay? Because of the impact of not building groins in some areas and building groins in others. Okay? Now, the second type of feature that looks kind of like a groin but isn't is another impermeable structure perpendicular to the shoreline, but it's on either side of an inlet. Actually, that's what I was thinking with the mouth of the San Bernard. Because there, the purpose is to reduce sedimentation in the inlet, to keep it open for navigation. That's exactly what you would want if you were a fisherman going down the San Bernard. So, here's the inlet. Here are the jetties, longshore drift, updrift deposition. Okay, great. Except, before those jetties, that sand can actually get around the mouth and continue downstream, down current, better said. So, the groin, or rather the jetty acts like a groin. It traps sediment. That's good here, but bad here. Now remember, the purpose was not to trap sediment. The purpose was actually to keep the velocity high in the channel, to extend the channel in essence until it got into deep water, or deeper water. There's still going to be deposition here. But the river sediment is being deposited in deeper water. And that sediment that was potentially going to block it, or could have blocked it, it can't. So groins are great for the mouth of a river. They're even pretty good for the updrift side of the shoreline. But they will cause downdrift erosion. Okay. You can see that here. This is a breach that was made for navigation on Matagorda Island. This is what it was like in 1942. Since then, we've seen erosion downdrift and a lot of deposition updrift. And notice there's still sediment coming out of here, but it's in deep enough water so you don't have to dredge it as much. Okay. So, jetties are good, except for the updrift erosion. Now, in a storm, like a hurricane, if you've got a real thin barrier island, you don't just get one inlet, you get a whole bunch of them. I mean, it just chops that island up entirely. But longshore drift will heal those cuts. So the natural process for most of the cuts that occur in a hurricane, particularly in narrow islands, is for them to be filled again. Okay, so that's kind of the good news. Okay, but they're also very likely to be recut in the next storm. Okay, so let's look at Fenwick Island. This is the last case study I'll give you. And actually, no, I won't. I'll come back to Fenwick Island for this case study. We'll finish up coastlines next time.